Doesn't feel that long ago that Damien Duff and Shelbourne were celebrating a dramatic title win up in Derry, but here we are. It is League of Ireland Eve and the 2025 season will kick off tomorrow night. Joining me for our season preview is Aidan Fitzmaurice. Aidan, how are you?
Good, thanks, Bill. Glad to be back.
Yeah, great to have you in. And our man in Norway, Dan McDonald, who is over in Molde ahead of Shamrock Rovers European Conference League tie tonight. Dan, how are you?
I'm good, lads. How are you?
Doing well. Yeah, it's an exciting time for League of Ireland fans. Just to give people a bit of a refresher of where we are heading into the new season, which, as I said, kicks off tomorrow night. Shelbourne obviously entering as reigning champions. They held off Shamrock Rovers and Derry in what was kind of a three-way title race. Ultimately, it was Shelbourne and Rovers going for it on the end of the season, and Shelbourne beating Derry in Derry to clinch that first league title since 2006. It ended up being a fairly disastrous season for Derry. They kind of finished fourth in a three-horse race, with St. Pat's pipping them into third spot in the end with 9 victories in a row for Stephen Kenny's side. Rory Higgins' team then lost the FAI Cup final to Drogheda, which saw his departure, Tiernan Lynch now replacing him, so a lot of upheaval there. And you probably know this story well at this stage. Mason Melia, the 17-year-old from St. Pat's, becoming the first ever £1 million player from the League of Ireland. He will join Spurs in January 2026, so he will play this season in the League of Ireland. And there's also a new TV deal. Virgin Media will show 1 game per round over the course of the season, taking the rights completely over from RTE. So some of the talking points just to set the scene ahead of the new year. Aidan, is this kind of Christmas Eve for you? Are you excited to unwrap your presents tomorrow night?
Yeah, a lot of us League of Ireland nutters and a lot of lads and lassies, women obviously support football too, explain where they're going. They're not going to a restaurant or a nice night out tomorrow night. They're going to Talca Park or Eamon DC Park or Turner's Cross. Yeah, it's glad to be back. It's a long off season in the League of Ireland. It feels a bit different this year because Shamrock Rovers are playing into December, but a lot of activity at all clubs. Bohemians having an overhaul, Waterford nearly a new team, Sligo. Everyone's had a bit of building work over the summer, so I think everyone's looking forward to getting back. A lot of us complain about being cold on Friday nights and long trips to Derry or a trip from Cork up to Derry. I think we're all just glad to be back. We love the misery, I think.
Yeah, but if some people are going to be cold tomorrow night, Dan, let's say you're going to be freezing today over in Norway. Like, it kind of shows the strangeness of this League of Ireland season for Shamrock Rovers in particular, I guess, still competing deep into European action. What impact will that have, do you think, on this season? Like, Rovers having not really much of an off-season. I know their games weren't every week, but they were kind of playing intermittently throughout the off-season when other teams had their usual break and then a regular pre-season. Would that put a different complexion, do you think, on the campaign in the early days or even later in the season?
Yeah, I think it's very possible, Will. I think it is possible now. Look, it's possible this European tie may suffer. I know some people might be listening to this. The game might be over when they're listening to it here, but like, there is a really unusual nature to this here. Like, previously, like before, when Irish clubs have played group stage football up till December, they haven't started the next season well, because it's just a weird one. This is even stranger because they've qualified, which is terrific, but it means that they're launching straight into it. And this sort of surreal week, where you're chatting to people over here and they're getting their heads around it, that, I mean, their season starts off with this big European tie here this evening, playing in the Aviva on Sunday, which obviously, for family and friends, I mean, Rovers haven't been in the cup final since 2019. So, like, for some of those players, like, it's a really still a big event for them. And then the second leg against Molde next week. But equally, chatting to Stephen Bradley about it last night, Rovers, the reason they probably didn't win the league last year, or certainly the reason, that's no disrespect to Shells, but I think Shells were out in front and totally deserved it because they had the pressure, like leading a golf tournament from the Thursday. But Rovers started very slowly. In fact, in recent years, they've generally started slowly and picked up a lot of injuries early last year. And Stephen Bradley was saying, well, look, we have to learn from the mistakes or the issues from last year. We can't be peaking for this week and then it'll catch up with us in a couple of weeks, because I guess their priority is still to regain the league, because the really big European money comes from being the champions and that champions route. So it's weird that while this is a very big tie here and you have to seize the moment, it could end up almost being lost in the importance of starting well in the league, because one of the, there's a lot of progress in the league in Ireland, but one of the weird vagaries of it still is that pretty much 2/3 of the league is played before July. There's a lot of Monday games in the opening week. So if you start slowly now, it can really hurt you. And I think there is a possibility it could affect Rovers. I sort of would agree with that fear as being a valid one.
Yeah, because at the moment, Rovers and St. Pat's are joint favourites, followed by Shelbourne, followed by Derry in the betting. Aidan, like it's interesting, obviously, as Dan says, having that Dublin derby to kick off the year is such a great way to kind of, I suppose, crystallise the momentum the league feels like has gained over the last period. Sandwich between two European ties obviously isn't ideal for Shamrock Rovers, but is it accurate to say that the league has never been in a better place? You know, the interest levels, Dublin derbies in Aviva Stadium, the new TV deal with Virgin, which has been, I think, well received. The interest level generated by obviously Damien Duff, among others. Season tickets seem to be selling really well. Is that a fair sense?
I think so, because maybe it depends on your perspective of your age. I mean, some people would argue that the 50s, 60s was a golden era where you had huge crowds, where you had really strong Waterford. It's very much a Dublin 1-2-3 last year. Waterford strong in the 60s. That Shamrock Rovers team, the crowds obviously then dipped in the 70s and 80s. But in terms of it, I think the difference now is it's appealing to neutrals, that the game on Sunday, Shamrock Rovers and Bohemians, it's not just all Bohemians and Shamrock Rovers fans who are going. Neutrals are going. A bit like the FA Cup final traditionally would have been just for fans of the two clubs. Now people go, it's a day out. It's something you go to as a family. You don't have to be a fan of either club. And I think that the TV deal, its prominence, I think, the League of Ireland was always hidden. RT would have matches on radio on a long way, for example, that the hardcore would listen to it, but the general punter isn't. The fact that there is going to be a game, that I think that's huge, that whatever about the heartlands, but the general club areas in Ireland that don't have a League of Ireland team, like Laois or Carlow or places like that you'd like to think that the pub will have Bows and Rovers on Sunday, and they will have Dublin derbies on, that it'd be natural to have the TV not turn to Sky Sports News or golf or racing or whatever it is, that it's normal, and people who aren't people from Carlow, Laois, Monaghan, as I said, those areas without League of Ireland football at the moment will watch it. Damien Duff helps, the personalities helps. You got Elise Mousset added into the mix as well, one of the biggest names to come in from abroad in the last couple of years. And the crowds, the fact that traditionally it's always been the case where clubs are selling tickets, they're trying to get people going. Bows and Pats are going to be full every week, no matter what. They don't need any promotion. They've got a waiting list for season tickets and memberships of Bohemians. Shamrock Rovers will push for full houses of the 10,000 in Tala. You're going to get good crowds in Sligo, Galway, Waterford. It is different, and the challenge is sustaining, because I've seen a lot of false dawns before. The League of Ireland has traditionally been boom and bust. We know that. The last time Shelbourne won the league in 2006, they were bust within a few months. They should have been in the Champions League, but didn't, because they'd essentially folded. So the challenge is sustaining it. But I think what's behind it, the investment from abroad, the support, the fact that Bows and Pats can count on 4,500 people every week, no matter how well or how badly they're doing, and the visibility from team being on TV. And the last point, Damien Duff, who just is he's probably the biggest voice in Irish football at the moment. Certainly, box office. And Dan, one, I suppose, additional wrinkle to the League of Ireland, kind of the increase in interest and the increase in prominence and just the general kind of progress is being made, is that all the teams this year are training full time. With that comes cost. It obviously comes with maybe an on-pitch improvement, you'd hope, but then additional cost with that. Like, what do you make of that kind of, I suppose, that kind of new element to it?
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, it is. I know that there was probably, in some eyes, like a charm to the old. I say the old League of Ireland, but that idea of this could be the guy who's sort of driving a taxi or doing whatever during the week and playing at the weekend. But sometimes we focus a lot on like competition within other sports in Ireland, but in reality, I think with football, it's the most universal game in most countries around Europe. There is like a professional structure of some description, and for a country the size of Ireland, I think there's no reason why we shouldn't aspire to having that. Obviously, being next door to England, it's always going to be difficult. I think Aidan touches on some valid points there. I'm a huge League of Ireland fan. I'm very optimistic about things, but equally, you have to be conscious that for a lot of people, the ship has sailed, maybe in terms of having an interest. It's hard later in life to suddenly change your sporting habits and pick up something. And I think probably a lot of people my age, have never got into it because there's almost a baggage associated with the league, a perception that it's hard to shake. You need that to change for the next generation of kids now. And I think a big part of it is that, well, these are professional footballers in your locality. Like, these are athletes. These are someone you want to aspire to be. And I think you have to almost get away from that sort of homely image and more to a sense of, well, here's Mason Melia. He's going to play in the Premier League, hopefully. You can go to a game now and you can see players who will play for Ireland in a couple of years. And what we have now as well is that while the League of Ireland often would have probably almost sat outside the structure of Irish football, the discussion of Irish football. I mean, it's absolutely criminal that when we had the golden years of qualifying for World Cups and major tournaments, that the league was just left to the side. It wasn't viewed as an important thing. Now Brexit has happened. It's changed it. And really, there is no way now that that the homegrown Irish stars of the future will not be affected by the League of Ireland in their lives. Even if they decide to go to England, go to Europe at 16, they are now still going to be in a League of Ireland structure at 13, 14, 15. So there is now a complete link that didn't exist before. There's a reason to have a stronger League of Ireland now for the betterment of football in Ireland as a whole. And that didn't exist before. And I think that's a massive opportunity. It has exposed weaknesses initially because we don't have the academies and the facilities. And that's why now it became an election issue last year. And you're possibly getting to the place where we now realize we have to address this. But I think that's the big change. And I think it's great now if you're talking to people, and we all have had these conversations, why should you go to that game? And sometimes, it's a bit of crack and the atmosphere. That won't be enough. I think some people want to know, who am I going to watch? It can't always be about the managers. It has to be about players too. And I think that's why it's important that we have a Mason Melia or a Michael Noonan or whoever it might be, because we will have our future Irish internationals playing in the league now. That's a big change.
Yeah, the Mason Melia point I think is really good. Like, what advertisement you could get for the league just before it kicks off, that this 17-year-old guy has been, or boy, I guess, has been, signed for Spurs for over £1 million. It'll certainly get people's attention who maybe hadn't been on their radar before that. Aidan, the Damien Duff factor obviously brings huge interest. A lot of success last year with Shelbourne, ending their title drought. Is he a popular figure among other League of Ireland managers, players? Like, are they anyway resentful of that fact that he's kind of getting a lot of the attention, or are they just, is this an obvious thing given his profile and kind of how quotable he is and how colourful he is?
It depends who you ask. Within Shelbourne, Damien Duff often references, he's built a kind of siege mentality and saying, no one likes us and they're having to go little old shells, and he's kind of picking on things that aren't really there. I don't think that attitude is really there, but Damien Duff feeds that to his players, and it works. They won the title last year. But I think outside, I think managers do. Clearly, we referenced it in this week, his issue last year with Daniel Reynolds, and he's had issues with other people. But I think other managers would admit that the profile he brings to the league just has never been seen before. Daniel Reynolds said at this league, he's in the league since 1991, but he's never seen anybody with the profile of Damien Duff. People think back to when Giles came back in the 70s. I think it's even bigger than that, and his voice and the fact that when Damien Duff talks, I think that generally people in the FAI, when they Shells have played on a Friday night, people in the FAI, they watch his interviews, which will be on Virgin now most weeks. They read the papers and read websites, hopefully read Irish Independent online to see what he said, because Damien Duff will have a view on Irish football and he doesn't hold back. And if he thinks something is wrong, whether it's to do with fixtures, scheduling, refereeing, he has a voice, and nobody in the FAI. I think in a previous era, managers were kind of told to quieten down, particularly the John Delaney era I'm talking about, when managers were brought up charges of disrepute. Roddy Collins, a famous example for comments he made on radio while he was Monaghan United manager, wasn't referencing Monaghan. He was brought up on charges of bringing the game into disrepute. There's no way that'll be chance now with Damien Duff. He can more or less say what he wants and people will listen. But I think people do. He's brought a profile to it, an international profile. It's kind of shorthand. You hear it on the radio all the time. And Damien Duff's Shelbourne. He's not going to be at Shelbourne forever. So the challenge again is for Shelbourne and the league to maintain that. But while he's there, people listen. And he's a contacts book. That's the envy of the world. He can get players in. I don't know what they've signed Mipo Adebeko without Shelbourne. A lot of players say that they sign for Damien Duff because of what he sells and what he brings to them, and the dedication he's brought. And you can see the passion. It's not fake. Damien's background wasn't really in the League of Ireland. He left here at 16. He went to Blackburn. He was probably very much outside the League of Ireland milieu, whereas someone like Mason Melia's played for Pats, Stephen Ward and Wes Hula, and all those people had a League of Ireland link that Damien Duff didn't have. But he's really bought into it, and the stuff he says, when he says it's the greatest league in the world, when he says he loves it, when he says that it's the biggest achievement in his career, I don't think it's fake. People believe it, and people buy into it, and it's just brilliant to hear. And it drives subscriptions, he drives viewing figures. And I mentioned earlier on about TVs. I think when Shelbourne are playing on Friday nights, people outside of, it's not just people in Ringsend, the old Heartland, and in Drumcondra are going to be watching Damien Duff Shelbourne. The country are going to be watching.
Yeah, it's not just a contacts book for transfers, like the amount of people he's come in to have talked to the team or make Ian McGeek and
linked to the Dubs, that doesn't help as well. Fenton and people like that have been
Yeah.
in, and that can't that can't harm. That link wasn't always there. There was kind of Dublin J was separate, but Shell's really because of their proximity to the stone's throw between Talca Park and Crow Park, and to link into that, and Shells aren't doing that. Bringing Brian Fenton along to try and sell 500 extra tickets. It's to lean on that. And Damien has said he will, whatever experience he can get from Jim Gavin or from Fenton, if he can get 1% of that to bring to his team. How did that Dubs team win all those titles in a row? Because Shelbourne is going to be very, very hard to win it this year. Winning it is one thing, retaining it is a different matter. And if he can buy into that Dublin experience, Mossy Quinn coming in as well, an added factor, giving them that experience off the field, Shelbourne is going to be a fascinating story.
Even bringing the fan in from the crowd last year to give the team talk, everything he does has been so colourful and eminently watchable. Dan, but for Shelbourne, I feel like Damien Duff's kind of pre-season team talk was almost written for him. Like, they're down third favourites in the betting. It seems that people have said, okay, that was a great story, but it's back to maybe Shamrock Rovers challenging, or St. Pat's with Stephen Kenny, who've recruited well and had a really strong finish to last season. They already seem to be in the underdog role again that I'm sure he loves.
Yeah, I don't think they'll mind that. I think Damien Duff was sort of talking last week after the President's Cup about, he's feeling nice and paranoid at the moment, which I think is actually a healthy state for him. Maybe not for other people. Maybe there's not a long-term shelf life in that, in being in that mood the whole time. But there's a real energy around them in pre-season. I think complacency is definitely the biggest enemy of any team that's won a trophy in any sport. I think he mentioned, it is incredible the amount of people he meets. I think he mentioned that they'd met Donncha O'Callaghan last week, and they were talking about his regrets he associated with the complacency after winning something and not following up. And that's sort of something he's tapping into the group. But yeah, they are. But the reason, Damien Duff is a magnet for a lot of attention because he's so quotable, and as a result, he got a lot of publicity last year, and we can see it in our own stats. Our League of Ireland stats were up by miles and doubled, and Damien Duff stories were the main contributing factor in that. But in some respects, that Damien Duff focus almost took away from the scale of the achievement of what they did, because it's very rare in football that a team with the fourth or fifth biggest budget wins a league. In any league in Europe now, it's really hard for a team to do that. And even this year, and the reason ultimately they probably are still third favourites this year, is that while their budget has definitely gone up, and I think there are plans there to increase their budget across the next 2-3 seasons, I'd imagine at the moment they're still not, they wouldn't have a budget that's close to Shamrock Rovers, St. Pat's, Derry have invested a lot. They're maybe in or around the top four for sure now, but it's still a sense that he's got some players there who wouldn't have commanded big money when they came to Shells, and they're sort of, their USP there almost is we are improving players. We are taking players who maybe in some cases have been discarded by other clubs, and we're making them better. Whereas maybe other clubs are signing more marquee players who've established CVs. But I think they thrive off it, and I think they've been underrated. I'm not tipping them to win the league, but I think they'll still be up there and go very close.
Yeah, even holding on to some key players like Sean Boyd, the striker from their title-winning campaign. There was some great quotes he had, last week about kind of the bond he has with Damien Duff, the love-hate relationship, and the reason, and how he'd almost never want to leave Shelbourne, no matter the offers that came up. It's a brilliant bond that he's created there that guys really want to play for him and stay there. Aidan, the St. Pat's resurgence last year was one of the stories of the season. It didn't get maybe as much coverage to some degree because the title race was so enthralling, but Stephen Kenny coming in during the season, obviously after the Ireland stint there was a lot of intrigue about how he might do, finishing with 9 wins in a row, and all of a sudden everyone is tipping them as title contenders or potentially even champions. What did Stephen do last year to kind of get this back on track, and why are they so hotly tipped this year, do you think?
He does what he does. Well, he improves players, and as Dan was saying earlier on, I think that's one of the strengths in Damien Duff as well. Not all managers are. I thought of this last year when thinking about when Jim McLaughlin died, that people who worked, Jim was one of the most successful managers we've ever had, and people who worked with him said he wasn't a great coach. His talents were, his gifts were talent spotting and man management or motivation. He wouldn't coach. He knew he wasn't a good coach. He'd leave that to hire good coaches. But I think Stephen Kenny improved players. He inherited a team that was struggling, low in confidence. And the Jake Mulroney we saw in the first half of the season compared to Jake Mulroney we saw. He just got more out of players. He has, and even the people out there who wouldn't be huge fans of Stephen Kenny for rivalry or whatever reasons, they will admit that is his gift, is getting into a player's head and bringing him to another level. What he did with that Dundalk team, bringing Brian Gartland, Andy Boyle, all these players who were kind of floundering a bit in their careers, weren't going, and they became a league-winning team on the basis of what Stephen Kenny did. And he did that. It's man management. It's maybe leaving coaching to others as well, but being able to get the best out of players. He didn't go out and buy 11 new players. He obviously they added a little bit in the summer, brought in Elbozetti and people like that, but they to understand why a player is underperforming, and Mulroney is one to me, that the Mulroney that we saw under Stephen Kenny was different to the Mulroney we saw before, and whether that's Stephen motivating him psychologically, improving his training, improving his diet, I don't know. It really is a gift, and he got them. They probably are. That's why they are favourites. They have an awful lot. The big thing for Pats this year is they haven't lost anybody. Shamrock Rovers have lost a couple. They would have liked to keep Neil Ferrugia. They would like to keep Johnny Kenny. Was out of their control. They lost Ara Burns. Pats have more or less kept everybody they wanted, and they've added with people like Barry Bagley and one or two others. So that's what makes Pats very strong. Pats are going to be, I think, very slow starters last year, pretty poor. I think you're going to see Pats really hit the ground running this year.
Well, the way they finished last season. Yeah, Dan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think with Stephen as well, and people might be familiar with him. I mean, a lot of people are familiar with him. It might be League of Ireland fans, but from his time as Ireland manager. And the mad thing about his time as Ireland manager, for people who've covered Stephen Kenny over the years in the league, is how he ended up with an Irish team with an identity that's very different from the football identity he's operated with throughout his career. And I think the big thing with Pats is wingers. You know, like all the good Stephen Kenny sides, you know, have been, you know, played with four at the back and had really good wingers. And like he signed Zach Elbozetti in the summer, as Aidan mentioned. He took Jake Mulroney and sort of revitalised them, and Brandon Kavanagh as an option. And all of a sudden they're playing with pace and energy and a threat from either side, which has characterised his teams. You know, that was the play that, you know, the type of play and the type of things that got him the Ireland job. And then he ended up in the Ireland job with sort of at times a sort of a sterile three at the back and no real width and incision in that department. And now it just looks like a Stephen Kenny team again. And that's why people think that this Stephen Kenny team can win the league.
Yeah, you know, it's just interesting to see Stephen go to St. Pat's. You know, obviously after the Ireland job, people were very curious as where he might go next. Would he want to go to England and get a club job there? And kind of going back to where he's had success and signing a 5.5-year contract. It was just a very eye-catching, you know, I suppose, move for him.
It was, and he had offers, and I don't know if there was actual conversations, but certainly Bohemians, when the job was available, would have liked to bring him back, and I don't think Stephen was ready at the time. The Pats opportunity arose a couple of weeks later. You know, he had offers abroad. You know, Dan has spoken to him before. I think there was one in Iran. So he had offers, but something about St. Pat's appealed. And I think as well, Stephen would have standards. And St. Pat's, we're talking a lot here about the teams and the 11 players and everything else. There's a structure beneath that as well that needs to be improved. So St. Pat's, what Stephen Kenny the reason he signed a 5-year contract is the stadium isn't up to scratch. Richmond Park just needs to be redeveloped. We know that, same as Dalymount and Talca Park. But also, the training ground. They were training previously in Ballyulster, wasn't up to scratch for Premier Division. Last year, they're renting the Sport Ireland facility from the FAI in Abbottstown. They don't have their own place. You know, Shamrock Rovers have Roadstown, Bohemians have DCU and the Oscar Trainer. You have your own sign, your own signage, branding. It feels like home. It didn't feel like for that. So I think that's what Stephen Kenny will look at as well. And to make sure the club keep pace with his ambitions. That's going to be the challenge for Shelbourne as well. Shelbourne still, Talca Park, I said it was down there for press the other week, and people working on it, lick of paint, you know, just improving kind of superficial stuff. But Talca Park is not fit for use in the long term. Shelbourne need better than the facilities they have in the AOL if they want to be a proper professional club that's capable of competing in Europe. But Stephen, if the club, Gareth Kelleher has backed him in terms of those decisions. I think if the club can keep progressing, they want to build a new stadium, they want to have a training ground. If they can match those and not have the boom and bust that St. Pat's do well in Europe, but they can't play their later rounds because they have to move out of Richmond Park, that your home is your home and you get to play there, which is the advantage for Shamrock Rovers in Europe. Shamrock Rovers can go all the way and play in Tallaght Stadium. Everyone else is going to have to play to probably, you could have a situation this year, if all clubs progress, 4 clubs looking to rent out Tallaght Stadium to play in Europe because Weavers Park, Talca Park and Richmond Park will not be up to scratch for the later rounds. So for the club Stephen to have ambitions and the club to match those ambitions.
Yeah, well, the expectations are certainly high heading into the new season. Dan, like, where are Derry City? Obviously, Tiernan Lynch coming in from Larne to replace Rory Higgins. You know, he won 2 leagues up there, so highly regarded. But Like how many scars will be there from how last season ended? I said at the top of the show, like they were vying for the title and ended up finishing in fourth. And then, they're thinking maybe a consolation prize of an FAI Cup against Drogheda, who, Derry on paper will be far stronger, and they lose that 2-0. And all of a sudden, a manager who people maybe anticipated would be there for the long haul and had been there for a number of years building, it looked like, is now gone and been replaced by someone else. So where are they now? How much of a taste will last season leave, do you think, heading into this year?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it'll leave too much. I mean, I was up there last week and I sort of did a piece for the Sunday Independent about their talk about training facilities again, and Aidan touched on it with Pats. I mean, Derry have now moved into the Derry GAA Centre of Excellence in Owen Beg on a temporary basis for a couple of years, and it's an incredible facility. And I actually think that is a big factor in removing some of the scars, because all of a sudden you're coming into a different place of work. It's like any fresh start in life. And like last year, I don't think people realise, and Murray Higgins has only really spoken about in the last couple of weeks, and some of the players up there I spoke to, how ridiculously shabby their arrangements were. I mean, day to day, they were driving, they would go to one venue and get changed, have to drive, get back into their cars, drive to another place to train, then maybe drive back afterwards to change in the first place, and then drive to another gym, and like, it was all over the place. And if you're injured, and a lot of players in Derry, were injured last year, you're exiled from the group. So there's no team building, no bonding. They struggled to train on a full-size pitch the day before. They had an embarrassing European defeat. So, like, there's a lot of things there that weren't ideal. All of a sudden now they're going to a state-of-the-art facility every day where you have everything you want, like a full-time chef, breakfast, dinner on site, games rooms, 2 gyms, everything. Training pitches they're working on at the moment, the actual quality of it, but otherwise everything is there. And I think that'll give them a freshness. The new manager, they've brought in a lot of players with really good CVs, like I think over 1,500 appearances in England and Scotland between them, over 100 Northern Ireland caps between them. They're really important, Derry, because I'm very conscious as we're talking here, we're just speaking about Dublin clubs, and I understand why that is, because the big characters are there at the moment, and that's where a lot of the money is, and it could easily be a top 4, of 4 Dublin clubs, or 3 anyway at least. And you need the provinces to be doing something. Like, you need Derry, and I think their recruitment of trying to almost sign the best of what's north. Probably disappointing some clubs in the Irish League, the Northern Irish League, by signing those players, but you need it. Like, I really hope they're competitive this year. But the one fear I would have, and the very obvious fear, they have a terrible pitch. They still have a terrible Astro pitch. They pick up injuries. And some of the big players they've signed have had injuries in the last year or two. And I'd just be a little bit worried about that. There's a lot of billionaires involved with the league. Philip O'Doherty in Derry has basically built a stand on his own over the winter behind the goal, where Harry Wood scored the goal. There's going to be a new stand there. But they can't do everything at once. And their pitch is a real issue.
Yeah, Aidan, like a lot of League of Ireland conversations, we're talking about facilities for training, stadiums that might be able to be used for certain fixtures. Dan is talking about Derry's pitch, which you don't hear as much as maybe some of the other concerns, but it's still such a big issue, isn't it, in the league? It
is. Not the legacy. If you think of the lot, we talked earlier on about the boom going back to the 60s and the sports that I can remember in my time, kind of 99, 2000, 2001, when teams went full-time professional, led by probably Bows, Shells, Pats and Derry, Cork, kind of a little bit behind that move. But the legacy of that was, there was none, because the training facilities were poor, stadiums were poor. Talca is the same as it was when Shells last won the league in 2006, bar like a paint. One stand can't be used, it's condemned. So that is so it's encouraging what Derry have done, and it's provoked a broader conversation in terms of municipal facilities. Do we need, it makes sense in Derry to have a facility that the GA players and soccer players can use. Logic to have one in Donegal that Donegal GA and Finn Harps can use. I know Mary Coughlin was speaking about this week and said it probably in her role head of GA and Donegal County Board, probably not realistic, but that's where the legacy will be, because you can have a run, you can have a trophy, but if you come back to a stadium that's not fit for use, and I said I would have a concern over next summer, it'd be great if all 4 clubs made progress. Where are they going to play? There was huge restrictions from UEFA on having teams in the same city, 2 teams visiting. You can't really have a situation where Shamrock Rovers play on a Wednesday in Tala and draw to play on a Thursday in different competitions, it's going to be very difficult. So that's what you want to see. There's progress obviously with Bohemians. Looks like Dadyman Park is moving ahead. I would still worry about where the pace is of the movement with St Pat's with their ground, with Shelbourne trying to get, not to give Talca Park a lick of paint, to have Talca Park as a proper stadium, and aside of that as well, conscious as well, showgrounds is perfectly adequate in Sligo. Turner's Cross is fine, RSC in Waterford, a lot of work done in Galway, named DC Park the last couple of years. But that has to be maintained. You can't just build a stand and then close it off and say that's done, because that's how you get left behind.
Yeah, and Dan, in your piece about Derry and Beg, like, which it seemed to fit so well in the sense that, like, it's kind of almost sitting idle during the week when Derry City will be training. Like, I feel like that's kind of a no-brainer, and there's other centres of excellence around the country that could potentially be tapped into for the same thing. Like, the idea of every team and every sport needing their own big training centre and their own stadium doesn't seem like a good use of resources.
No, it doesn't. And look, I think I can appreciate as well. I mean, from the football perspective, it's a take, I suppose. I mean, there are historic failings, within the sport which explain why they don't have the facilities. Now, obviously, I think they would feel at times they deserve more support from the state as well. And there's no doubt that the GAA have been more savvy. But look, I suppose at the moment people are high on the exhilaration of an NFL game coming to Dublin. It's there's the gates are being thrown open in certain instances, but actually on a day-to-day practical basis, there's a lot of logic behind it, and there is rental income that's associated with it. Like, Derry aren't using that for free. Like, you have a facility that isn't being used in more when you have a professional league now, as you do a Premier Division level, and players are training on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday mornings, or whatever the schedule is. I think there is a logical element to it. I appreciate your sensitivities. It won't work everywhere, but you've seen in the most recent sports capital grants that there's a lot more of a move towards municipal facilities. Like, Sligo Rovers got very good news to do with the showgrounds, but I think there's a rugby team linked in with that there's been applications that have made progress that are being fast tracked or being accelerated if there's another sport element with it, and like, even in Tala now, I think their Schools Cup final in Tala, and there's things happening there, and across the board that's what needs to happen, because I think, you come to other countries, you come to somewhere like Norway, and okay, I appreciate it's a different climate, maybe different sports, but you'll have these velodromes that like service, several sports, and they realize that it's not about competition again within sports, it's about the benefit of sport, for kids. And even within underage sport in Ireland, there's a lot of competition and rivalry and stuff between codes, but actually, the big win is if everyone is active and involved and there's something to aspire to in the area, whatever that sport may be. So I hope we get to that place, because there are still places in the country where there's issues, like Treaty United in Limerick. People may not be aware, they're training at 7:30 in the morning this year as a part-time First Division club, because they don't have anywhere suitable to train in the evening. So that shouldn't be the way it is.
God, yeah, that's pretty stark. But as you said, the Derry example is a good one. It'd be interesting to see if there's other kind of similar things that can be worked out if needed in other areas of the country. Aidan, Dan made the point there about the Dublin teams maybe occupying the top 3 spots potentially. Like, what about, say, some of the teams outside of Dublin? Then Galway United, who had a great season last year. I think it was their highest league finish in 30 years under John Caulfield. Cork City back in the top division. You have Waterford as well. Like, any of those teams intriguing you think could have a push and be maybe slightly better than people think?
It depends. I think last year it reminded me a bit like the Premier League, where there's clubs in the Premier League who just being there is enough. So Brentford, Bournemouth, Wolves or whatever, they're not realistically thinking of in the Premier League now or in the next 2, 3, 5 years. Simply being there is progress and staying there. And I think that you could argue that Galway United, Waterford and Sligo Rovers, the fact that they weren't involved in relegation, they were all pushing for Europe at various stages and fell short, but they all had good seasons. Drogheda even better because they won a trophy. So it's how they improve. I think they are pushing on a little bit hard because the recruitment, they probably haven't been able to get the players they wanted. Cork City got a lot of players in on loan, which isn't always ideal, those kind of short-term deals, unproven. I think in an ideal world, Galway and Sligo would have recruited more players, recruited better. Waterford, huge changes there. I think two of their stars of last season, Sam Sargent, the goalkeeper, and Barry Bagley in the middle, even though they missed a lot of the season through injury, they were two of their key players. So Waterford being unknown quantity. So I think they'll be probably the same. I don't think there'll be any great clamour to, as in John Colville has to qualify Galway United for Europe. I think both clubs will be happy enough building on what I mentioned earlier on, building off the field, building your support, building your commercial revenue, keeping that going. You see how close they were in the Cup last year. The Cup is winnable now, because if a big gun is gone early on, as happens with St Pat's last year, with Shamrock Rovers, if a big cup falls early on, so if you, I think those clubs will probably plot that course and hope that St Pat's get Shamrock Rovers in the first round of the FAI Cup, that Derry get Bows, so then you have two of the big guns gone to move in. But I think to build on what they had last year, and probably more of the same. But I do think it is going to be hard to break into that top three we had last year. For all the positives about how good Waterford were, they were all in touch for Europe, as I said at one stage. It was still a Dublin 1-2-3.
Well, I thought that's the beauty of when it's the night before the first game. Anything is possible. Anything is possible for these teams. Dan, we touched on some of the kind of key transfers earlier. Obviously, Mason Melia, Johnny Kenny, Farouja, Dara Burns departing Shamrock Rovers. But is there any kind of move off season that maybe went under the radar that you'd think could be a really key addition or subtraction for one of the teams heading into the new year?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Aidan already mentioned someone like Barry Bagley, who's gone to St Pat's, who was at Waterford last year, wouldn't have a massive profile within the league. I think, like Waterford, for example, have brought someone like Tommy Lonergan back to the league, who was was at Fleetwood, but was previously at St Patrick's Athletic. And sometimes you'll have these younger players who've maybe been fringe players at maybe bigger clubs, and they'd suddenly ignite when they sort of drop down a level, but drop down a level maybe in terms of like sort of the profile or out of Dublin. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing obviously springs to mind. I think what I would say is a lot of the talent is concentrated in around Dublin, and it's hard for those clubs that Aidan mentioned to compete. But equally, I still think there's a better spread of players around clubs than there was in the past, in terms of like someone like Cork City, who I think it would be respectable enough for them to stay up this season. But you sort of forget that they have Shawnee Maguire there now, like, who again has played for Ireland, played a lot of championship games, who the last time he was in the league scored 20 goals before July, and like was incredibly exciting. Yet you have someone like that with a team who could be 7th or 8th this year, and I think that's like a good aspect of it. I think that I think Sligo Rovers and Galway have both brought in players from Australia and from the New Zealand Australian route. They've had to be creative, so there's a couple of unknown quantities there who could click, and that can sometimes surprise. And I think the frustration for Sligo Rovers is, like last year, I think John Russell has maybe lost up to 8 of his starting 11, and like he brings in this guy called Ellis Chapman from Cheltenham Town, who was a little bit of an unknown, was fantastic, but then he joined Shelbourne, and it's almost like you're doing the recruiting for other teams, like you're finding the gems, you polish them up, and then they're gone, and that's certainly an issue for some of the clubs.
Yeah, and the point you make about, I suppose, the talent being concentrated in Dublin is an interesting one. I saw John Caulfield saying that they just can't compete with this, the money they need to pay guys to leave Dublin. But it's a tough one for teams like that. Maybe this can't compete on the financial scale. I guess, Aidan, we'll turn to predictions then. We talked about the favourites and the likely runners and riders. Who do you think ultimately will win the league this year?
The consensus is St Pat's, and I'm going to go against the grain a little bit. I'm going to go with Shelbourne. I just think that the Duff factor, first of all, that's often what hampers teams in terms of trying to retain it. That simple fact of doing it again. I think he will have leaned a lot on, Dan mentioned Donald Callahan, Aline, just the outside help of how to do that. People often say it's hunger. It's just you're not the same player the second year. So how to players say, well, it's gone, it's in the past, but that's not really. They're still trading on last year's glories. So I think Shelbourne they've kept. We talked about players earlier on. I think Kerr McEnroy, who Shelbourne have signed from Scotland, who I've never seen him play. So I'm saying this completely blindly, but how highly Damon Duff has spoken of him. He saw him when he was at the Celtic Academy. In terms of players, I'm looking forward to seeing. He's one. The other one I think is you were talking to Dan earlier about players. Again, apologies for the Dublin focus, but Niall Morahan at Bohemians. I think he's what they missed last year. He was Bohemians. I saw a lot of them last year, and they were lacked leaders. They really missed people like Liam Buckley and Keith Buckley last year. Moran, I think, is the kind of player who will give them that bit of steel and that bit of leadership. But to win it, I do think Shelbourne, I just think they've added in the right ways. Ellis Chapman coming in is a huge addition because he can play across so many positions. McEnroy in an unknown quantity. Mipo Obadeko, he could have, if he goes to form, he could have 15, 20 goals by mid-season. Shell struggled for goals a bit last year, a lot of 1-0s, 2-1s. So Shelbourne to win it. Probably St. Pat's Shamrock Rovers for top 3. Bohemians maybe knocking on the door if they can get it right. And I think everyone else is just going to they just want to stay away from the bottom 2 to finish bottom, possibly. To curse the FAI Cup winners, but possibly Drogheda, I think, on own quantity, and I think Cork are going to have a hard year as well. But I'm going to go for Shelbourne to win it.
Interesting. Against the grain, I feel like most people are kind of going other directions. Dan, what about you? Do you agree with Aidan, or are you going some other direction?
No, I agree that I think Shells are going to be right up there. I probably am leaning towards the Pats one at the moment. I think it's because they had their business done really early. I think they've had a really good pre-season by all accounts. I think they've got depth in every position. They have bringing in someone like Sean Hoare. I think they have the option to play with a back 4 or switch to a back 3 at times if they need to. They've got Aidan Keane, Mason Mealy, Conor Carty, so they have 3 strikers. We mentioned the wingers. They probably need to prove that. Look, they have some very good players who've turned it on for a couple of months at a time. The question mark still is, do they have the mentality to win a 36-game league season? Can they do that? But I am leaning that way. But it's, I was flipping back towards Shells. I'd be sort of thinking Pat Shells. If Shamrock Rovers signed a sort of a striker who you thought could ignite, it might just be very obvious. But I'm a little bit concerned about the wing backs for them as well too. That they've just lost players in positions that they'd really energise them. They're excited about some of the young players at the club, but I just wonder, could it be tricky for them? And for me, probably Derry to complete the top 4. We're amazed we've got this far without talking about Liz Mousset joining Bowes and what he could do for them. And Bowes at times last year needed a striker. If he ignited, he's one of the most sort of colourful characters that's probably ever come into the league. He could be brilliant, or he could be gone in 3 months. It's actually very hard to predict which scenario it's going to be. I am leaning towards Drogheda at the other end. I think they've had some important injuries in pre-season as well too. And even though they've gone full time, they're probably still working off a small budget. Them and Sligo Rovers are the 2 smallest budgets, I think, by a fair distance. And I think that could catch up with them. I will say, I'm not sure again, people talk about young players. I think Cottle O'Sullivan at Cork City is a name to watch. I know Tim Clancy, who gave Mason Mealy his debut, is pretty much equally excited about the potential of Cottle O'Sullivan. He was in the first division last year. He's a stylish midfielder who scores he cuts in and scores a lot of goals with his left foot. He turns 18 in March, so he's probably going to go in the summer. He's not on as long a contract as Melia was, so he probably won't go for as much money. But there's proper Premier League Championship interest in him. And I would say to people, if you want to go and see someone who might go up that level, try and see Cottle O'Sullivan play before he goes, because very, very positive reports about his potential.
Yeah, interesting name to watch. I think that sets the scene nicely, lads. Dan, I suppose you're going from Norway straight from the airport to Talca Park almost tomorrow?
Yeah, I am going to step in home. Apparently it's, Valentine's Day, and should say hello to the family and stuff. But I live quite close to Talca Park, so I know Aidan's actually going to be doing our match report, but it would be rude. I couldn't be walking distance away from that game and not go to it. It just seems wrong. So I'll be checking it out.
Well, it's set up to be a great year. Aidan, Dan, thanks for joining me, and enjoy the season ahead.
Thanks, Will.
Thanking you, Will.